So welcome everyone. I'm Zab Johnson, the Executive Director and Senior Fellow of the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And the aim of the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative is to bring together brain science and business in an effort to improve business, drive new discoveries and applications, enrich community engagement, and enhance the education of future leaders. Together with my co-hosts, human behavior expert Leila Entezam and faculty director of Wharton Neuroscience, Michael Platt, our aim with this podcast series is to explore vulnerability, authenticity, and trust from diverse perspectives, including neuroscience and human behavior. There's an urgency for professional landscapes to create environments that foster vulnerability, authenticity, and trust, especially for successful teamwork. However, this often goes against the cultural and individual norms of those who work in these areas, as there's the persistent perception that this can be counter to what is expected behaviors that demonstrate leadership, authority, and expertise. All of today's guests work in areas that have traditionally struggled with how soft and hard skills are intertwined, and each, as leaders, have worked to more optimally integrate these into learning and development in their organizations. So we're really excited to have them share their perspectives with us. So today, the fantastic guest panel is made up of Susan Sweeney, who's Senior Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer at EnPro Industries, Matthew Hoffman, Senior Leader at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Miami SWAT, and Luke Carlin, who's a former Major League Baseball catcher, now catching coordinator with the newly renamed Cleveland Guardians. So let's get going, and we'll start with brief introductions from each of our panelists. And we'll start with Susan Sweeney. Susan, welcome.
Thanks, Zab, and thank you all for the invitation to be part of today's webinar and podcast. So I'm Susan Sweeney. As Zab said, I am the Chief Human Resource Officer for EnPro, which is an industrial technology company. It's a public company with a global footprint. Although I'm sitting in the lead people chair, I actually have led businesses in the organization as president of some of the divisions. So this is a pretty exciting topic for me, and it's pretty unusual, as stated earlier, to have this discussed in a business environment, particularly a public business. So I'm excited to be part of the conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And now we'll turn for a brief introduction from Matt.
Yeah, so my name is Matt Hoffman. I'm a special agent in the FBI. I've been an FBI agent for 12 years. Previously, I was employed as a police officer, and then before that, a U.S. Army officer. Currently signed as the senior team leader for the FBI Miami SWAT team, which is a regional tactical team that covers all of South Florida, Southeast Florida, from Key West all the way up to Vero Beach and part of the Everglades. I was previously an instructor of the National Tactical Training Unit, which oversees, administers, and conducts all the training for the 56 FBI SWAT teams and the hostage rescue team, the national asset based in Quantico, Virginia. I've been involved with Wharton in some capacity since 2017, really getting with Wharton Neuroscience in 2019 when we were looking at how do we optimize human performance to produce most favorable outcomes in high-risk situations and scenarios that we teach and then find ourselves in operationally. So really excited to be here. This has been something I've been really interested in, and hopefully we can provide some feedback and some interesting commentary based on the high risk and high performance teams.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Luke.
Hi, thank you, Zab. It's an honor to be here, and I feel humbled by the rest of the panelists on this group. So former Major League player, as Zab mentioned, played 15 years and found out about halfway through my playing career that I had a desire to coach as well. So once they tore the uniform off of me, I jumped right into coaching. And with that has come a lot of challenges. Our game is changing very quickly. So right now, my current role is a catching coordinator. So essentially, I help lead a team of coaches that are in charge of helping our minor league players, our minor league catchers, develop into major league talent, ultimately to help us win a World Series. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks to all of you. We're really excited about the dialogue that we're about to have. But before we dive into our discussion, we thought it might actually be useful to ground people in a bit of the underlying neuroscience. So I'll actually turn things over briefly to Michael to tell us a little bit more about the social brain and building connections with others from a neuroscience perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Zab. And thanks to our esteemed panelists. Really grateful to have you here. So just a brief kind of overview of really what machinery in our heads allows us to connect with other people and to manage those interactions in an ongoing, spontaneous way. And so this is actually really a major discovery, in my view, of neuroscience in the last 10 years or so, which is that each and every one of us has within our heads a connected network of brain areas that we now often refer to as the social brain network. And so it kind of begins at the back of the head. So I'm nicely not, I don't have any hair getting in the way here, so you can kind of imagine what's underneath the skull. It kind of begins at the back of the brain where we're basically the information coming in from our senses, the sort of pixelated worldview, for example, that comes in through our eyes, begins to be reassembled into images, and that social brain network, kind of that information begins to become more abstractly processed, so our brains begin to tell us something about who's there, like there's a person there, is this a person we know or don't know, based on accessing memory, and then increasingly more kind of complex information is processed as this moves forward in the brain. And there are kind of two key pathways that are in this social brain network. One that moves a little bit lower down in the brain, you can think of as being more emotional. And it kind of relies on decoding the emotional state of a person that you are interacting with through sight and sound, and their emotional, their facial expressions, their posture, their tone of voice, changes in their pupil diameter. We're not even aware of that, but our brains are picking up on that. And really the only reason that we make facial expressions is so that our brains can convey information to somebody else's brain about what we're feeling, basically. And that emotional stream kind of runs to the front of the head and ultimately leads to the process of resonating emotionally with somebody else, which is we think of as what we call empathy, right? And so and there's a couple of key brain areas that are involved in that. Basically, the more activity you have there, the more likely you are to help somebody who's in need. So that's sort of the emotional component. And then there's a more cognitive component that runs a little higher up in the brain. And that pathway is kind of tasked with trying to figure out what somebody else might be thinking. So this is a process we call mentalizing or theory of mind. But it begins with just trying to assess, like, what are they paying attention to, and therefore what's important to them. And based on that, what might they know, or what might they want, right? And then maybe from some other information from past interactions, are they trustworthy, right? Is it somebody I can cooperate with, or are they more likely to cheat me? And then those two streams of information, emotional and cognitive, kind of come together and shape what we do next. Do we have a good conversation? Do we break off the conversation and walk away? Do we cooperate to achieve a goal? Do we learn something from this person? And that's really how this all works. And what's really remarkable about it is it's spontaneously, it's just dynamically changing during our interactions with another person. And we now know that basically the degree to which this is wired up in an individual, like if you have a healthier, more robust social brain network, that tends to predict that you have deeper or more numerous connections in the real world, which is really remarkable. So we know that there's a relationship between the sort of health and vitality of this network and kind of how good you are at building connections with other people. And one important point, though, about that, we know that health and vitality of your social brain network is partially due to what you got from your parents, right? If your parents are kind of really social, you'll probably get some of that too. But a lot of it's up to you, right? So this social brain network, we know very well now, is like a muscle. So the more that you use it, the more you exercise it, the more it grows. The more it grows, the better you're going to be able to manage, to build connections with other people. We can take deeper dives into any of these processes later, but that's sort of just a foundation for what we're going to be talking about today in terms of building trust and teamwork and good team chemistry.
Great, thank you. So we'll go ahead and get started with including the perspectives from our guests. So I've known Susan for a few years now, and I've been really impressed with her translation of learning and development into a really interesting situation with a sort of traditional manufacturing and engineering company. And so I wanted to begin with her by sort of asking her to sort of give us a sense of how she's incorporated ways to increase trust amongst those that she has worked with over the years.
Thanks, Zeb. So I think one thing about trust, you really have to create the right environment. So our values at EnPro are safety, excellence, and respect. And a few years ago, we started talking about not just physical safety, which we're pretty good at for an industrial technology company, but psychological safety. And I think that pivot and inclusion of, creating intentional psychological safety, and what does that mean? What does that look like? What behaviors are expected to do that was really pivotal for the company. So in order to build trust, I think you have to have psychological safety. Someone has to feel safe, and they have to want to connect to you. As Michael mentioned, there has to be, a connectedness, and, you can build on that to do a shared purpose. So in a business type setting, if you can figure out how to get that right, the business piece of it, the working together, getting the diversity of ideas, et cetera, all kind of flows. And so creating that environment, at least for me, was really important. And so some of the things, the tools that we do, we actually meditate before every meeting. And that sounds kind of crazy. And, I've invited people to join. I've even invited Zab to join in a couple occasions just to see that. And the reason for that is because we all come to the meeting with lots of mental chatter, things going on in our lives that are distracting, and to be fully present so that you do have that opportunity, to connect and to build trust with others means that you have to basically be there and be present and listen. So we actually do a meditation. It could be a couple minutes, it could be 5 minutes. Sometimes it's longer. And then we do a check-in. And you might say, well, why would you do that? Well, we all come to a meeting with a particular frame of mind. And so if I'm distracted because, something happened to one of my family members over the weekend, and I could just say, hey, I'm a little distracted because, and I can share as much as I want to, as much as I feel safe doing, but just to let the rest of the group know how I'm entering the meeting. And so those are a couple practices we use. We also create forums. We have what we call courageous conversations. And every Wednesday in the morning, we have an hour set aside, and we have a theme, we have topics, we have different people come in and talk, and we have these conversations about a particular topic. We've hit everything in the past, by the way. I mean, we've hit race, ethnicity, religion, politics, all the things you're not supposed to talk about at work. We try to create the safe environment to do that. And then we break into small groups. We actually use the good features of Zoom, which are you can break into small groups and you can actually make meaning and actually have a connectedness between a smaller group to talk about that topic a little more in depth. So I'll stop there because I could probably talk for the rest of the podcast about this, but it is with every intentional action of trying to build that connectedness, the environment of being psychologically safe, and then the trust comes from that.
Great, thank you. I think that's, we'll probably circle back in a little while to you, Susan, because I think that brings up some really interesting questions around, how that has been taken by the team, especially, the engineers, et cetera, on your team. But I'll turn things over to Leila to take things to our next panelist.
Thank you. I actually would like to direct my question to Matt. Matt, I can imagine how important trust is in your environment and often, life and death situations. What are the signs that a group has developed high degrees of trust, and what are the signs that they haven't? What are your metrics for determining that?
All right, can you guys hear me? Because I'm frozen on the screen. Okay,
Yes.
I'm not super intently taking notes right now. No, I really like that question. It's interesting. I'm going to answer it from the perspective of an instructor and then kind of an in-service perspective. From the instructional standpoint, we are really looking for social cues of belonging. So when we're training students, we bring them in from all the disparate 56 FBI offices, and they are put together in composite groups. Those groups are then put through decision-making exercises, and those exercises involve simulations with role players and sophisticated paintball guns, and they have to apply tactics and make decisions. We watch them during the event, but we equally watch them when they are in their resting time. During their downtime, we want to see what the social interactions. So we actually have an instructor fully assigned to just monitoring them when they're not working to see, are they physically proximate? Are they having a good time? This is high stress training. It's individual stressful, and then it's also we apply stress at different times in different areas. Are they having a good time? If a group is physically proximate and they're having a good time and they're laughing and these are signs that that composite team has built trust and cohesion. If they're physically present or physically together, but they're super intense, that's a challenge. That means that team is developing trust. They're not quite there yet. What we really worry about is if someone is separate from the group. And once they separate physically, did they separate or were they separated? Was this a group dynamic thing, or did that person feel like they were violating the trust of the group to the point where they had to actually distance themselves and they're in their own head? So we have remediation efforts and remediation methods for each of those, but we just got to kind of start exploring what and why. And within that same space, it goes to what Susan was saying about that check-in. So before we even start remediation, we'll be like, hey, what happened? What's going on at home? What's going on here? Are you in the right frame of mind to complete this training? Do we need to hit a reset and send you home? We had one that was like that, where a student had witnessed a horrific car crash and had provided first aid right on the way down the day before he started the class. And unfortunately, the victim in the car crash was a young child who had died despite his efforts to save her. And he carried that through, and his performance was indicating that he was isolated. He didn't have trust in the group. The group didn't have trust in him. He had competence and performance issues, and we didn't know that until we did that check-in. So we started doing that check-in earlier in the process. From a team leader perspective or from an in-service perspective, we're really looking for people seizing opportunities, seeing and seizing opportunities as they rise versus teams that are overly communicative, teams that are looking around, teams that need a lot more confirmation before they're willing to maneuver. So in our environments, we're operating in the public sphere. There's subjects to the investigation, there's our team, then there's people who are the public at large, and our responsibility is for everyone's safety. But as we look to resolve high-risk incidents, we have to move and communicate and try to reduce the risk to force and then increase the chance that we're going to have a successful outcome. And teams that don't have trust in each other will be hesitant to see and seize opportunities, and they'll be hesitant to really move aggressively through space without ensuring everybody's around. So that overly, just going to the other point of what it looks like when they're not confident, they don't have trust, they're looking around, they're overly communicative, they need more confirmation than is necessary to accomplish the task at hand. And then lastly, from a team leader perspective, I'm looking for the same social cues I am as an instructor. I want people to be proximate to each other. I want them to not form cliques. I want to make sure that they have a healthy dose of FOMO and nobody wants to miss out. They believe if they're not present for every operation, they're not present for every event, the team won't trust them as much, and therefore they may be left out when it's what we call a game day or a serious incident. So all those things are health measures, and a lot of that stuff, we got language from Wharton, we got language from the Culture Code, we got language from a lot of books that are written by your peers within neuroscience, because it helped us really hone in and be efficient in how we're processing this and how we're looking at these so we can start remediation early.
It's remarkable to hear the level of intentionality in every step that you all take. I love that. I will turn it back to Zab.
Great, thank you. And hopefully maybe Matt's video will come back online, but he's fine. We have a good voice line for him. So I'll turn things over to Michael for the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Zeb. So by process of elimination, clearly the question's going to Luke, but I have my own fascination with sports as a failed athlete. But I think this is a really interesting dilemma here for coaches in particular, because on the one hand, you want to be able to build trust with players, especially young players, but you also have to help them develop expertise, help them overcome the areas of their game that are weak, right? And that they may not want to reveal, and they're going to try to hide that kind of thing. And so I think I'm just curious, like what do you see that as an issue, and is that one that you encounter, and what kinds of things do you do? What do you find effective to kind of overcoming that barrier so you can build trust?
Yeah, that it really is interesting for professional baseball, just because we have a language barrier a lot of the times. So I think being able to communicate your expertise in a different language is a whole other set of issues. But the lack of being able to do that sometimes, does present some challenges in building trust. And I think, there's a lot of like our mindsets in the coaching process that would help us convey some expertise and still keep a healthy dose of curiosity about the player. So I think one of the things we would first, like analogy in my head, or what I was told as a young coach, was just, every, you've got this keychain full of keys, and you just need to find the right key for that player to unlock. And I think at that point now you're allowed to share your expertise. And I think it really depends on the player. So if we're talking about like motivational interviewing techniques, or showing vulnerability, really being curious, empathy, like you had mentioned before, Michael, just of how important that is to stand in that player's shoes, using resources of coaches around us to really find out what is going to unlock that player for us. Sometimes it is a little bit more of the soft stuff, and then sometimes it's competence. So, if you get the first rounder from Vanderbilt, he might just want to know what you know and help me get to the big leagues as fast as I can. And that's all he wants from you, is your technical expertise. Whereas maybe a young 17-year-old coming to the United States for the very first time that doesn't speak English really needs to find a connection and feel like he is something bigger than than himself at that point, and really needs more of that connection. And your level of expertise really isn't going to sound well with him right now. So a lot of it's really just this discovery process that we're trying to figure out. It's a mindset as coaches, where ultimately we're trying to impact behaviors to help them get to the big leagues. At the same time, that looks different for every single player. So what is it about this player that we can learn and be curious about and make a connection for behavior? So it really is just a mindset that we try to take as coaches of like, okay, empathy first, let's connect before we coach. And that is everything from a hand on the shoulder to somebody's really locked into their, technique or whatever, and it's following interests at that point. So we try to really just the mindset of, okay, where are they at? Where are they going? Let's follow them so that we can then share some expertise if we think that we have it.
Luca, that's super inspiring, but it seems incredibly daunting if you're putting in that amount of effort for, how many guys show up at spring training? It's like hundreds, right? Honestly, I don't know how you do it. That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I'm not saying we do it well. We're just trying really hard.
What's interesting to me about that is, I like the lock and key analogy, but it's also the other side of the equation is the coach, and how are the intricacies of one coach who may deliver the same message different than another person who may deliver the same message, but one just resonates more in any of these leadership capacities. Same with Susan and Matt, that how much it's both sides of the equation and how that same thing can be received differently from one person's brain than another. And to Michael's point about that volume, or even if you think of the size of, Susan's organization or the number of teams Matt's trying to work with, that how much back and forth that takes to figure that out.
I'll just add, that's an interesting question because it took me a while to figure out that just because I said something, in my mind, I said something, everyone heard it, right? They processed it, they got it, they went and did whatever I asked them to do. And it took me a while when I had to repeat things multiple times, like, why is that? And so I really had to do some work about realizing where people are. You have to meet them where they are. And are they in a good spot to hear? And when they hear, does their amygdala kick in and they just shut down because you've somehow triggered them? And so there's a lot of care. I hear this in Luke's answer, right? To figuring out where a person is so that you can communicate and help them with whatever it is that you're trying to either tell them or share with them. And that is a different way of leading, I think, than most of us were trained to do. And so, what got me to where I am right now isn't going to help me to lead the organization in a different way is how I think about it. So,
Susan, this was so exciting about reading, some of the stuff that Michael, Zab, you guys are working on, is that we would expect to see, and Matt hit on this, we would expect to see certain behaviors or certain things when that connection is made. And you had just mentioned it, Susan, like, what's the response after your interaction? And if we're really mindful of that, we can see if we've connected or if we just went up against a wall and it's like, that didn't work. Are they mirroring us? Anyways, there's a really cool thing there that I think as leaders, we can say, like, we can do all this stuff on the front end. Are we mindful of what the response is afterwards?
So I find that that resonated a lot when I went to full-time instructing. So we had a two-touch rule where if a student wasn't getting through, we would change the language and reapproach. And after 2 touches, we would switch instructors. And it was definitely trying to get the right key to the right lock. And then one thing that we did, which was divergent from my time in the military. In the military, we always had mantras. You said the same thing the same way every time. We did the opposite. We went to as many courses, as many schools, and many different units and said, how do you describe these things? And we built a catalog. And so everyone had different ways to unlock students at different efficiencies and different effectiveness. So it stopped being this is the school hop mantra. It started being, this is the objective. These are what we're attempting to accomplish. And this is how we are reaching our population, which is also a different age, different brain stuff. A lot of this that Zab came down and kind of explained to us of, this may work with these people, but it's not going to work with your people.
So sorry about your video feed, Matt, but you're here with us, so we'll take the black box. It maybe makes you seem more mysterious. I just wanted to remind our attendees I know I see a question in there already from Sid Chopra, but to remind people that you're welcome to put in questions along the way in the Q&A. We have reserved the 1 to 1:30 slot to get to those questions if we don't have time during the rest of the podcast. Sorry for that little brief interruption to our flow. I just wanted to remind people that that's freely available. So Susan and Matt, I'm really interested to find out your perspectives on I think in both of your organizations, like traditionally, I think there has been this reluctance of sort of acknowledging the teachability of soft skills, right? I think there has been this very concrete understanding that hard skills are something that, for better or worse, right, that people are more adaptable with. But that soft skills are sort of, and as Michael said, it's not true, right? That your social brain doesn't change, it is like a muscle, and it does respond, right? And so therefore it is, these are the kinds of things that one can facilitate growth in. Susan, you're doing remarkable things and I think by addressing this, but I was just curious as to both your perspectives, right, on the sort of, has there been pushback, on the teachability of these sort of softer skills? Should we stop calling them soft skills? All kinds of things sort of come to mind.
I can answer first, and then Matt, if he wants. I agree with you. Trying to differentiate soft and hard, they're probably life skills, right? And I think this time that we're living through right now, it makes it even more important because you're not physically with people. So you've got to be intentional about trying to connect, just to do your work or just for your own personal mental health. So I would say, I've been at this for like 10, 11 years with EnPro, and it's been a learning journey. And so it has been interesting because we do have a company that's made up of a lot of engineers, really talented, bright people. And so part of the thing about neuroscience that I like is it's based in science, right? And so if you go to an engineer and you explain the science of the brain and why, having a little empathy and approaching a situation in a different way will get you a different result, I think most people are open to that. It's not, it's not secular, it's not, religion. It's just, we do our meditation. It is because we are trying to have control of our brains, of our thoughts, really. And so that approach has been helpful, I think, with the folks that join the organization. It's not for everybody. We have people that leave because they really aren't buying in. But I do think that what you get to a certain point in, let's just say, the hierarchy of a career, and at some point it actually switches. And so if you want to be a leader, you can be appointed to a position. Matt may have a different opinion of this based upon his background, but at some point people have to want to follow you. And if they want to follow you, they have to trust you, and you have to be good at connecting, or they're not going to want to follow you just because, of your positional authority. And so that, I think, actually is a pretty interesting switch that happens. And when a leader realizes that that's part of the, formula of being quote unquote successful, it almost drives the need to, what do I need to work on, right? Because the leader limits the organization, and the leader has to continue to learn and grow and to be more intentional about how they show up and how they're helping and, frankly, serving their team. It's not just telling them what to do, it's asking questions on what the team needs. So I'll just stop there. Matt's probably got a different or added response.
No, added. It's interesting. In the FBI, we are all basically all the same rank. So my team, I'm peer led. I'm not actually. I have no real authority over my team. There's 37 operators when we're at full strength, and they are all the same rank as I am. So you earn every day, and you're in service every day to those teams. One thing that you mentioned that I thought was interesting is you said at the very beginning, the intentionality piece. For me, when we work intra-team, I have to be very intentional because we tend to default to critical communications. We tend to default to fairly brusque behavior. It's just not the so-called soft skills were something that I had to be very intentional about. The interesting thing that we've had a ton of success with down here is external relationships. So talking to our customer base. So I work at the behest of FBI case agents who are attempting to do something either unique or high risk. And we have to earn their trust and respect. And a lot of that is softening those edges that we naturally bring into these things. So that seeking to gain a better understanding, asking follow-on questions, ensuring that we're considering their equities, being a leader and a partner at the same time within the organization. All that stuff has been, it's simple stuff. It has been profoundly successful with kind of reimagining how we interact with our external environment, with the case agents and the investigative squads, and what their goals and priorities are. Because as our friend Preston says, everyone's the hero of their own story. So how do we honor that and respect that while still providing the services that we're being called on? So it's been quite a challenge, and I've grown much more in the soft skill area than I have developed any of the hard skills I spent years teaching.
Something I would add to that, especially that last piece you said, Matt, I coach high performing executives primarily. And one of the main things we talk about is that as you move to the upper echelons of rank, it's much less about your tactical skills and your knowledge and skill set, and more about fine tuning these things that are what impacts behavior, influences people, moves teams, creates performance. So people care much less about, do you know how to do X, Y, Z from a skill set perspective? You already showed that you knew how to do that. That's what got you here. And so it's beautiful to hear you all reinforcing that message.
The irony is that, and the neuroscience is pretty clear on this, is that as people ascend in rank, they tend to use their social brains less. And so it has to be, in fact, that much more intentional. Otherwise, they're going to be missing out on all of these clues, everything that's going on with the people around them. And so it really resonated what Matt said about kind of having a flat hierarchy there, and that no one's above anybody else. I mean, that it seems precisely designed to harness the brain in just the right way to foster teamwork.
I have a question to the group. So one of the interesting things we have, and Matt, you had mentioned our friend, Dr. Preston Klein, who's just been so helpful in our area as well with professional sports. And he writes about just these two groups, these two tribes, two teams, and he calls it the community and the communitas, and a group of academics and a group of experienced, operators in your world, Matt. And one of the issues that we run into is bridging the gap in leadership. Susan, the execs, or Leila, the execs, aren't always the people who had the playing experience, and therefore there's a language barrier between the two. And so that's where I'm really interested in, maybe your experience, Matt, or your Susan, or anybody's for that matter, about bridging that gap from, okay, there isn't this rites of passage necessarily that some of our executives have gone through. Maybe they haven't played. And sometimes our operators, our coaches don't have the language to communicate up. And sometimes our leaders don't have the same language to communicate down. And so it creates this lack of organizational trust at times. And so we're thinking about maybe different ways to bridge those gaps. And I think that could be very useful here. I want to hijack your questions, but it's just something I was like, oh, got all these cool people on this call.
I think organizational vocabulary is really important. I mean, I mentioned, some of the forums that we have. I think we do that because we talk about, what the expected norms are and get people used to hearing the words. I think when you first join the company, when someone says the word centering, you would say, wait a minute, what is that? But I think if you went to any meeting with anyone that's been with us for more than a month, you could use the word centering and they all understand what it is. So it's being intentional about what's important to build the culture and what that vocabulary might be. The other thing that struck me as you were asking that question, Luke, is that we have this phrase, we say leaders teach, right? And so the thing about teaching, and I do a little bit on the side myself, is that you then have to become better at it and push yourself, right? Because none of us want to get that question that we don't have the answer to. I'll just speak for myself, right? My ego doesn't want that. So I make sure I'm super prepared, which means I'm learning twice as much probably as what I'm trying to convey to the group. And so we set it up pretty regularly where leaders at all levels of the organization teach different forums or lead different classes. And so that kind of switches, the positional authority, and I think helps integrate some of those ideas and vocabulary better into the organization. Just an idea.
The two things I would add to that, I love that, Susan, is ego and mindset. So I always start executives with that idea of your ego is going to get in the way of you growing, and your mindset is going to be what's going to propel you. Are you open to receiving new things and having the growth mindset to say, is there a different way to do things? Am I willing to park my ego to say, I don't know, as opposed to, especially when you move up in rank, hey, I got here, I must know what I'm doing. I must be good at this. and that can inhibit you from, to your question, Luke, being open to bridging that gap, as opposed to, if you're willing to put that aside, then being able to say, to admit, okay, well, maybe there's something else to learn here.
Luke, to your earlier question, because I really liked how you framed that, and it goes back to a little bit with Susan about going up in an organization where you're not necessarily, you don't share the same traits as those the people that you're ultimately responsible for or leading. One of the things that we ask is, are we solving our problem or are we solving their problem, and can we do both? So with our leaders, they're being judged and evaluated, our executives, on possibly different metrics. So what we find to be truly super important, that might be something that they don't value as much. And so we're really trying to be, in fact, we have a sign in the team room that says, are you being transactional or transformational? And it's a question posed to us by others. We certainly didn't come up with it, but it was, how are we transforming the landscape to ensure success here? Or are we simply just worried about our own equities? And that piece of being able to solve their problem before we solved our problems has helped tremendously to smooth those rough edges of the interactions between the executive piece and the very senior grizzled operator who's got maybe a little bit of a chip on their shoulder and a couple rough edges that could be smoothed down.
So I think, so Michael, you have some interesting perspectives on that, sort of come from this idea of social hierarchy. And that also leads me to a question that I'll point towards Luke. But I'll let you, Michael, I'll let you speak here, but I'll prepare Luke for my question, which is, that in professional sports, unlike the FBI, apparently, it doesn't have a flattened hierarchy, sort of almost by definition. It's almost impossible to have that. And to EnPro, right? I think that there's any large scale organization also struggles with that, right? So there are ways, and Susan has brought up interesting ways that they've gone to try to flatten the hierarchy through these sort of courageous conversations, those kinds of forums. But it's sort of a question to you with the Guardians in particular, but also just Major League Baseball altogether. How have you struggled with with facing that in particular, and like what might one do in order to try and help offset some of that? So maybe I'll ask you that question, and then Michael can jump in and talk a little bit about some of the perspectives from other animal models.
Yeah, there's two folds in baseball. I think there's the hierarchy of the players going from A ball to the major leagues, and then just the different authorities that go with that. And then I think that there is a similar struggle for our coaches as well, in terms of do you want to be a rookie ball coach? Do you want to be a major league coach? Is that your aspiration? Does that promotion path look the same for every coach? I think that there's a lot there, and one of the ways that we're trying to this is a problem in Major League Baseball, and I think it really gets in the way of building organizational trust, is this maybe lack of transparency around promotions, going through this hierarchy. There's no clear, if I were to say today, I'd love to be a major league manager, there's nobody that would be able to chart a path for me. We would say, okay, Luke, what are the skills that you feel like the major league manager is going to need to have in 5 years from now? And then can you develop those skills? What can we do to help you? And I think obviously that's a really cool way of looking at it, but it does create some opportunities for how well you can communicate these skills, because the person that's making that decision is essentially a group of executives maybe that haven't done that before, right? So there are little things like this that I think get in the way of building organizational trust in Major League Baseball. I think one of the ways that we're trying to think about it with the Guardians is we do have domains. So we have like pitching and catching and hitting and defense and all that sort of stuff. And each of those domains are small teams. And that is a very close-knit group of coaches. And with that, there's those team dynamics and there's a lot of trust in those. And if those little domains also have an advocate or a shepherd essentially that helps communicate the voice of that group, and that that leader can bridge the gap that we were talking about earlier, Susan and Leila, right? It's like, okay, now we feel heard, now we feel appreciated, affirmed, acknowledged, all that good stuff. So it does help create a little bit more trust, where sometimes the domains don't have the visibility up and the leaders don't have the visibility down, because we're in 7 different locations in the United States and we speak different languages and we're doing different things. So that's how we're trying to do it right now. I don't know if that answered everything, but it's the best way I can say we're trying to deal with it right now.
No, I like that. And it's a good point of like, if the organization is vast, right, it's sort of like, sort of parceling it out in a way that's manageable. And I think, of course, like it's much easier to do that in a smaller scale. So I think that's a nice approach, right, in a complex organization. Susan, did you have anything else to add before I point over?
I was just thinking about some of our kind of meeting guidelines that we have. And so one of them is that it's expected that everyone puts their voice in the room. So I think we've all gone to meetings where you have potentially 1 or 2 people do all the talking. There could be 10 people in the room and the other 8 just kind of sit there. So we actually have, you have to contribute, like you have to say something. So it's not just this silent absorbing all the information. And so if someone doesn't say something, I am very likely to say, so Zab, what are your thoughts about that, right? We haven't heard from you. Or conversely, if someone's taking up all the airtime, we just kind of politely, respectfully say, you've put a lot into the room today, so maybe want to hear from some of the other folks here. And so I do think that not just being at the table, having a seat at the table, being in the meeting, but contributing also pushes for engagement, and kind of pushes for this opportunity to build the trust, the connection, et cetera, because that you're expected to be part of it. You're there because you're worthy, your input is needed. And so if we do that at every single interaction, it actually, I think, does tend to build a more engaged workplace. So I just add that because I often go in and say, I'm going to speak last, especially hierarchically. If I'm, the highest, whatever ranking person in the room, I'm not going to put my opinion first. And I want to hear from everyone else. And I'm going to ask questions and use inquiry instead of advocating for a particular idea. But those are just processes that, I have to keep reminding myself to do. It's not part of my nature. And it's intentional to try and build that kind of vessel for everyone to feel part of the team.
Great. So I think Michael has some interesting perspectives just on the biological nature of sort of what we're fighting against here with social hierarchies.
Yeah, no, I think everything that Luke and Matt and Susan have been talking about in terms of the challenges, but also the opportunities of navigating hierarchy. I mean, hierarchy is deeply baked into human nature. I mean, it's how steep it is can vary as a function of culture and the organization. But let's face it, for human beings, as just like our primate cousins, our success is due to both cooperation and competition, right? So they're in delicate balance with each other, and for that reason, we do have this deeply shared biology. So a lot of the features that we just talked about in terms of, say, how much you engage your social brain when you're dealing with individuals who are low ranking than you, we find exactly the same things in monkeys. So it's it's this deeply baked in stuff, which means that if you're not intentional about it, it's just going to happen, right? It's just going to roll out the way it rolls out, and it's rolled out for 28 million years. And so we really do have to be super mindful about it, and all the kinds of practices that everybody's just talked about, I think, are very impressive. It takes a lot of effort to kind of overcome that. I don't want to say instinct, but it is, it's something that's super built into the way that we work.
Susan, to your point, I really like how you are controlling the room to make sure that everyone contributes. We had some cultural challenges to overcome here that you were expected, if you were a new guy, to show up and shut up. And immediately I realized that we were losing a lot of really good ideas, a lot of experience, because people come to the FBI as a second. It was my third career. Usually average age for the SWAT team members when they're starting out is 30, and they have they've got 30 years of lived experience that they're bringing to the table. And just because we had a reset onto their involvement in this team didn't mean they weren't former special operations accountants, police officers, scientists. We have all sorts of backgrounds, and we were losing a big portion of that because only the leaders were speaking, and the loudest person in the room isn't always the person we always want to listen to. And so it had to be very intentional in those meetings. And for us, that was through after action reviews. So after an operation went, to discuss what happened, and to point out when I made mistakes as the team leader was a big challenge. There was a lot of deference, even though the organization is flat. I've been full-time in the SWAT capacity, and I've taught at the national program. So I had actually taught almost half my team prior to being assigned down here. So they already knew me from that instructor role, which is automatically a hierarchical role as it is. And then overlay that, this was my second team that I had led. It was challenging to get to hear those voices. And when we started hearing that, we got diverse thoughts and ideas, and we started getting more effective problem solving. People understood, and we realized that when we would act on their version of the plan, or they would be involved in the planning process, they'd have a much better understanding of what we were attempting to accomplish. They'd seize initiative better across the board. It had downstream effects, but it was a big hurdle to cross, that they could have the amount of trust to speak up without expecting to be slapped down.
One of the things that's interesting to me is if you think about everyone's contributions so far, the level of complexity that we are talking about with geography, virtual versus not, culture, language, experience, the stress of the environment, the background, engineers, life and death, Luke talking about, the people coming from different parts of the country, different parts of the world. There's so many things that go into trying to build these relationships. And back to Susan's point about being intentional about doing that in the complexity of today's world and in these landscapes, I feel like there isn't any other way to be successful at creating these spaces of trust and vulnerability and authenticity, unless you're being intentional about it. I think to Michael's point earlier about it won't just happen by default. So I think there's it's a lot of respect to each of you for the effort that you and your organizations are putting into actually being intentional about that.
One of the, Matt, you going back to what you said about the after action review, that's something that we do in baseball as well. We'll review a game or whatever practice. And I was speaking with Michael a few weeks ago about some of the stuff to help build trust with pitchers and catchers. And he challenged me with this idea of enjoyment as well. And it made me think of something that I did when I was managing, and I think just over the course of for some context, a major league or a baseball season's a really long time, and it's a lot of games and a lot of days, and there's not a lot of time off. So we're trying to, as a coach, build in some of this enjoyment and fun. And I'd be interested if there was more thoughts on this from this group. But one of the things we would have is we would have a dartboard in my office, and every number was assigned to a fine, but maybe it was like, hey, you have to buy donuts for the coaches, or maybe you have to give our trainer a foot massage, or it's just these fun little things. And if and when we were doing these reviews, or if you show up 10 seconds late for a stretch, it's like, oh, you got to throw a dart. And then we have these meetings around these dart throwing things. And, the players just love it. But as a leader, you got to throw the first dart, or you have to be willing to throw the darts. I'm just be interested. It seemed like a really cool experience for our group of players. to kind of like come together and have some fun and enjoyment. How are you guys thinking about some of that enjoyment and fun in your areas?
I think I'm gonna go get a dartboard because I think that is a great idea. We've done lots of things, but I would say most of it is pre-COVID, right? Because we're not getting together in person now, so that's a big downer. So we have to figure out ways to connect, using this virtual environment. I've done crazy things with my teams though when I was a president of a division. I mean, I remember we were in Arizona one time, and I took them cattle rustling. And that sounds crazy. Everyone get on a horse, and we had all these 12 cattle, and we took them through the desert. And the most terrifying thing to me was once everyone got on the horse and we were leaving the corral, I realized that 10 of the 12 people had never been on a horse before. And so that, I'm thinking, what the heck am I doing? But afterwards, that evening we're sitting around a fire pit, and the conversation we had, it was so open. And we were actually there to work on some really complex work things, but it had opened up a path because we had this different way of talking about it. That was really remarkable. So I do think doing something outside, whether you read a book and talk about it, right? Because it just gives you a pathway to look at a problem or what you're trying to resolve or what you're trying to work on as a team in a different way. There are lots of ways to do that, but you got to disrupt the environment, I think, and do something fun, to your point.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I think the dartboard for accountability within an organization, a high performer organization, is fantastic. One of the challenges we have is that I don't want to come across silly, but what we do is for a living is what some people do for recreation. So, we shoot, we conduct CQB, high dynamic vehicle driving, and the work itself is generally fun and enjoyable, but it's punctuated by long periods of boredom, sitting in cars. And so having that peer-based accountability, I think, is fantastic. I do think there's something to be said about leaders throwing the first dart. I really like that from Luke, because going back to that AAR process, one of the things I did was I seeded, trust me, I make enough mistakes organically, but I seeded one of my senior guys to call me out on one of the first AARs we did. And that was to expose that I expected the feedback. I make the most decisions on any given operation, which means I've got the most chance to screw something up, something we got from Coleman Reese. And people would avoid or talk around the mistakes. And so we had to plant that seed and be willing to throw that first dart. And from there, it started blossoming into a lot more accountability. But I do like the idea of overlaying that with something a little bit more lighthearted in a fairly serious business.
I agree. And I suspect, Luke, that we may see the re-emergence of the dartboard in Ted Lasso next season. Here, not about precision, right? But about group dynamics. So I'll know where the point of inspiration was if it appears. So we only have a few minutes left for the formal program, and then we'll have a slightly more informal dialogue. I don't know what that really means, because I feel like we're just dialoguing, but we'll answer some questions that have come up, including, Matt, just to prepare whether or not the FBI has policies against giving foot massages to one another. But I thought we would just sort of take a wrap with each of you as panelists, sort of giving advice, I think, to other leaders out there on, what would be your best advice sent out there to others leading organizations to really think intentionally around issues around vulnerability, authenticity, and trust. And I'll have Luke, why don't you go ahead and be the first?
Awesome, because there was no way I was going to follow up Matt or Susan on any of this. So I do appreciate going first, Seb. The one thing that I think, beyond finding the time and resources and understanding the importance, is this concept of connective tissue. And so, like anything else, if it's a one-off meditation, which it's not, I'm not saying it is, Susan, or if it's this one-off dartboard thing, but if it's not connected to the rest of everything that we do, it won't have any foothold. It'll just be checking a box. And I think that's I think that's a lot of challenge in Major League Baseball right now, where it's just, and Matt said this earlier, transformational, not transactional. Like sometimes these things just seem transactional. And so, what is this connective tissue that's giving life to building trust and making connections that's going to sustain? So really being deliberate with some thought there, that would be my 2 cents.
Fantastic. Matt, why don't you go next?
So I love the connective tissue idea. I'm of the belief that teams are grown, they're not built, and that like a house plant, you gotta feed them and water them. You gotta give them some exposure, but not too much. And sometimes you gotta cut them back and redirect them. And so growing a team involves a lot, but it goes back to, again, Dr. Klein with the people watch, they don't listen to you. So modeling that behavior and understanding that I have to be authentic because they're going to see too much and too often for me to hide anything. And eventually ego depletion, being tired, all that stuff's going to catch up to me and my true self's going to come out. So trying to establish that authenticity with the guys. This is who I am. I'm not putting on a front. I can't conceal this too long. Then that allows you to grow in your own skin. Obviously, Susan and I were just talking about growing and learning as leaders, but to some degree, you are who you are, and any attempt to conceal that is going to eventually cause some challenges down the road.
Well, it's great. Susan.
I think one question I ask myself a lot is, what's it like to be on the other side of me? There have been times when I haven't liked that response, or what I would fill in that answer with. And so I ask myself that a lot because it kind of helps self-manage, right? And keep in check. So I would just share that. The other thing I do, it's a practice, is every week, and I'm not perfect at this, but I will reach out to somewhere between 10 and 15 people in the organization. I mean, sometimes I cold call them. Sometimes I'll send them a note and say, hey, let's chat. I have to be careful because from my position, that can make people super nervous. But I just say, hey, I just want to check in, right? And maybe it's just 20 minutes, and it's literally just to say, how are you doing? What are you working on? Just to connect at a very, personal level, because I care deeply about the people. And the only way to really show that is to be intentional, to say, hey, I'm going to take, 20 minutes, half hour, sometimes it's an hour, of my time to find out what's going on with you. It also deeply informs my work, right? Because I do find out what's going on and how, what's the pulse of the organization. So I think that's usually well received. Sometimes people are surprised, but I do it with good intention. So
I'm literally going to steal notes from all three of you.
Yeah, thank you. So this will be the final wrap for the formal hour of our program. And so those of you who have to go, you're welcome to leave. But now we'll move into a more informal Q&A session. So those of you who would like to stick around and would like to put questions in the Q&A, we're looking forward to them. So I'll start here with one, and this time I'm going to direct it to both Susan and to Michael and Leila, actually, just because of the nature of the question, which kind of came in from Sid Chopra, and he's wondering, whether remote meetings actually help to build trust. And what might be, and I'll have Susan answer that from an organization that has largely been working remotely, and whether she's witnessed any change to that, helping to facilitate new relationships and new developments, just because I think it does sort of even out the playing field in some interesting ways, while it also has communication impasses that it doesn't recover from. And then I'll ask sort of Michael and Leila to weigh in on some of the science and human behavior side from that question.
So I have to give a shout out to you, Zab, because a few years ago, you taught me a few things about the brain and how we process talking on video before we had the pandemic and had to go to this. So I just want you to know I've used many of the things you've taught me to help the organization. I do think being on Zoom and like working, you miss the human contact, right? But what you can do is invite more people to the table. And I think that does help with trust because it's more transparent. You have more access. you're not limited by a table, that holds 12 people, or the need to get on an airplane and, manage all those schedules. You can just set up a meeting and people can attend. Now, the bad part of that is that people may feel they have to attend and then they spend all day on Zoom. I get that balance. But I think if it's thoughtful about, this is what we're going to talk about, and this is why I think you being part of the conversation, adding your diverse set of ideas and thoughts to help us come up with the best idea or the best solution, I do think it can expand opportunities and exposure for people so that they can grow and learn in a different way. I know for myself, when the pandemic hit, I was spending, 15, 20 hours a week, on airplanes and cars, going across the ocean every month a couple times. All of a sudden I had more time. And then how was I going to use that? Not necessarily on Zoom, right? But getting out for a walk or connecting with people. I could do the same business, but I really freed up a lot of time by not having to travel. And so we talked about that. And so what are you going to do at that time? Don't pretend like your day has to be 9 to 5. Maybe you start at 6 in the morning because you're an early bird and you take a break when you take your kids to school, or make it so that it's not work and life and trying to do a work-life balance, but it's just how you're going to balance your life. And so that conversation in the work setting was pretty impactful for a lot of people. And the pandemic was difficult for many people. I understand that because you had everybody in the same room on the same internet wire. But what we talked about was what works for you. And if you've got a day when you don't want to be on video, just say, hey, I'm not on video today. And just let everyone know that. And it's more authentic than feeling like you have to show up to a meeting a certain way with a certain look. So I actually think it expanded some of the boundaries that people set for themselves as a work expectation, and was a little bit freeing for many people. I'll stop with that because that's a big topic.
That's terrific, Susan. I think it's a really positive spin on how video conferencing Zoom can really improve access and reach and make things more efficient. But I think, to get to your point that you made earlier in the whole session, everybody really, to get the most out of it, you really have to be present, right? And for the most part, that means having your camera on. There are certain days or whatever, there can be certain situations where I think it's appropriate not to, but given that we're working with such an impoverished data stream, and if there's lagging, all kinds of things make it just so much more challenging to process the information, which is why our brains hurt, after we've been doing it, for a few hours. And so it's, I think that's important to recognize. That's real. Zoom fatigue is a real thing. Our social brains have to work so much harder to acquire the information that they are used to getting much more seamlessly in the real world. So I think recognizing that is an important way to kind of optimizing the online meeting so that you can get the most out of it, but don't spend your whole day in a meeting as well.
I think I would probably take both of your contributions together. Absolutely, it's more effort to be engaged in Zoom meetings, but I think Zab also commented on this earlier. There's a way in which it's leveled some of the playing fields, even from a social cues perspective of, I don't know what, how tall are you, how short are you, how this are you, how that are you, and so it's removed some of those details. It's brought more people and more diversity to the conversations, and there's power in that. But I think ultimately it's about creating some new rules in this new landscape. That it is, what are the rules about camera on or off? What are the rules about everyone must contribute? How do we celebrate what we stand to gain from this new landscape and mitigate what we stand to lose? And Susan, I love what you said about, instead of work-life balance, just this life balance, that how do we then offset the Zoom fatigue and the downfalls of that with other areas of your life that you can enhance because of this, that then allow you to balance out some of the challenges created here?
Great, thanks. And now my follow-up question is going to be towards Luke and Matt, and that's one towards, we sort of touched on it in the session, but like vulnerability, okay, like this is a really hard thing, I think, for both professional supports and for tactical. It's really a difficult thing to do, and I think people dance around the conversations around vulnerability in particular, right? Where we could use other words like like trust and authenticity, but vulnerability makes people squeamish, right? So what's your perspective on is that just a vocabulary that maybe needs to shift? Is that a word that needs to be addressed in some other way? To Susan's point of like shared vocabulary and discussion, so that it doesn't make your organization squeamish.
So I'll lead out. Interestingly enough, that piece was, historically a challenge for us, because you were called as a SWAT team to solve someone else's problem that had exceeded their capabilities or their scope, and to show up and ask questions and seek to gain better understanding of the problem set just wasn't really done. But I learned something from Colonel Tom DiTommaso, who was a pretty legendary guy within the special operations community. And it wasn't about having the first answer. It's about making the right decision at the right time and taking time when you had the time to be collaborative, to collect disparate or diverse opinions and information. And that resounded on me, because there was always this idea that you had to have this snap judgment. And within that framework, you start exposing vulnerability when you're asking junior people their opinions and where they needed to be. But the word itself, I think it does have a place within the community, because we want to highlight this. We want to just kind of tear apart that old archetype of, hey, I'm going to show up and I'm going to solve the problem. Because what we found, and this came from some conversations I think you were part of, Zab, was that when we do training, if it's highly variable training, we end up with competent folks that don't have a lot of confidence. But if it's very scripted training, they're very confident, but they don't have a lot of competence. And very confident people that don't have a lot of competence get people hurt, and they don't even know why they got hurt. And so we really need to, when we have situations where it's truly life or death, use every resource, open ourselves up to better ideas, to criticism, to different course corrections, and all that requires an element of vulnerability that just enhances the overall chance of missing success, and reduces the risk to force in these environments. So I think it's got a place. It just needs to be introduced in a context that slightly softened at the beginning until people understand what we're getting out of it.
I think, like Zab, you brought up a really good question about like, do we change the language? I think vulnerability shows up in a lot of different places. For us as coaches, we would say it's curiosity. Just because there's just no way that we know all the answers to all, like just to have to partner with a player to help change their behavior, to know what motivates them. We just can't have the answers to that. So we're just really curious about that. And with that gives us an opportunity to ask questions, to listen, to do a lot of the trust building, activities, to be really empathetic, to share stories, I think is a big part of it. So in that sense, we're looking at it. I think vulnerability gets confused sometimes in our world with, it has to be this like self-disclosure. And that's not always the case. It can just be curiosity in some things. It absolutely can be about sharing stories. The other part that's really interesting about vulnerability on the coaching side is that sometimes, we might not be right. And so, like, for instance, Zab, if you wanted to work on your swing and I could, you're like, hey, Luke, can we go do this? And I'm like, yeah, well, hey, I think you should do this, but if you don't see results right away, that's going to be a problem for us. So it's gonna kind of like challenge that trust. And so I'm being vulnerable, offering suggestions of like, hey, we're going to try this out. And, we might not see the fruits of that labor for a little bit. And then the other part of where I'm thinking about it is almost the willingness to be wrong, but it's almost like the courage. I don't know if this is going to sound right, but the courage to lie sometimes. So, like for instance, a player, they don't want to show their vulnerability at times when they're facing maybe a competition lower or higher than what they're at, and so they feel threatened, and it's not as a challenge. And so, as a coach, sometimes you're there to help them, find a little bit more confidence. So sometimes you might have to, tell a little white lie, like, actually, no, you're really good at this. I'm excited to watch you go do this. Where really the stats would say that they suck. But now we've given them an opportunity to say like, okay, we've and not praise, affirming behaviors to get some of this, to get a little bit more confidence. So they're willing to see things as a challenge and not as a threat there. So I know there was a lot to unpack with the word vulnerability for me, but I think as a coach, I think the biggest word that we would change it to would be curiosity.
Yeah, I really like that, Luke. I think it's a great way to think about sort of a vulnerability that's approachable by everyone, and that curiosity itself is it's a mindset that involves exploration, and we know that same kind of mindset is engaged when we take the perspective of others, because that means getting outside of our own head and seeing things through through different eyes, from a different perspective, both of which are really critical for connecting with other people, but also for coming up with new ideas and being innovative. And so I think there's a lot there in that comment, which is, I think, very powerful. We had a question in the chat about the future of work. So we're kind of talking about where we are right now in work of a variety of sorts, but the future of work, in which I think we can anticipate, and certainly surveys have indicated that business leaders anticipate doing more virtually, doing more in a hybrid setting. And we know that automation is going to come into many different kinds of processes and begin to remove the human element. So, what are your thoughts on this? And given everything we've talked about is kind of like the human part of the equation is what's so critical. How do we navigate this? And is there and I'll put this out there for everybody, is there a special role potentially for neuroscience in helping to make that, to help navigate that path?
I don't have the answer, but I could take a stab at just a thought. We use the word soft skills. I actually think those are, when I said they're the life skills, I do think those are the skills that will differentiate humans from, computers. And it's kind of astounding when you think, and I don't want to offend anyone, right? But that you could do law type work, right? The work that lawyers do with a computer. You can do accounting. It has digits, it has numbers. You can clearly do, conveying material from one spot to another that used to be done by people in manufacturing. There's so many things that are quickly being kind of taken over by computers. And so as humans, we have to figure out, how do we continue to learn, grow, connect? And that's where the magic is, to kind of use that human part that I think we've probably, at least in business, we've buried for a long time. Leave your emotions at the door, just show up and do the work. Well, you got to really think about it when the work can be done by computers. So all that stuff you left at the door, you need to go pick and scoop up and kind of embrace and develop and use it in a different way. And I think these conversations in neuroscience are where we need to be talking about for just that reason. And they're difficult. Because it's all the stuff that most of us, at least over a certain age, have been taught not to use at work. But it really is, I think, the differentiator.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I mean, I'm as hopeful as you are, I think, about our place in the future and in the future of work. But we know there's a lot that we need to understand to really optimize hopefully for, the not only that economies grow and we're productive, but that humans flourish. And I think there's it's like, I'm an old Star Trek fan, and it's kind of like there's that utopian future we can aspire to where inequality is flattened, and people get to pursue their aspirations and dreams because they've been liberated by technology rather than kind of enslaved by technology. So yeah, fantastic.
I'm sorry, I was going to add one more thing. I'm sorry. It also seems to me that the world's getting so complex, right? That, if you're a leader of an organization or a athletic, team, or, another group, as Matt is, you can't solve it by yourself. I mean, I don't think the computers are going to solve it either. And so you have to show up in a different way, right? You have to somehow be able to manage your thoughts and not make up the stories, and use mindfulness and all the neuroscience. I know about this much compared to you guys, but to help you do a better job with dealing with what you're trying, to solve or resolve. So I'll just add that, because that to me is the human part that we have control over, that we should try to figure out how to maximize.
And I think that back to Luke's point from earlier, that's the joyful part too. I mean, I don't know what makes a computer happy, but it's like, I think I know how to get a laugh in the room, and that's part of human connection.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing so much of this coming up now, right? I mean, I think it's on most display actually in professional sports, Luke. I mean, I think but I know that there has been a lot of conversations, like to Matt's, to sort of Matt's cadre, in special operations and the military and tactical law enforcement. And law enforcement in general, right? There's been all this stuff about, like, what do we need to do to make people whole humans, right? And not just automatons doing the work. To Susan's point, how do we bring back well-being, right, and limits into the conversations, and how do we move that forward? I wondered if either of you have any perspective there.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thought, especially with the advances in baseball. It's anybody that's familiar with Major League Baseball has just seen a trend of more data, more tech, more analytics. It's still a person hitting a baseball. It's still a person throwing a baseball, and still a person catching it. What's really interesting, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, so I'm going to answer my own that's along the same lines, is what's really fascinating about your work, though, is this, like, I think my understanding of how the brain works right now is that it's essentially just a big prediction machine. It's trying to make predictions about what's going to happen. And when we're in sync, when we've got this connection with other people, it seems like we should be able to predict behaviors a little bit more effectively, or with more authenticity or correctness, or not sure the best word there. And so in baseball, it gives us, when I was talking to Michael about the pitcher-catcher relationship in particular, like we need to see the game the same way. We need to be predicting behaviors the same way. And so this gives us a huge tactical advantage of, recognition prime decisions. Can we share the same experiences? Can we be on the same wavelength? And then in the opposite of, like, what are techniques for us or tactics for us to grow in connecting with our opposition in the sense that we can predict their behaviors more correctly. And that gives us now strategical advantages, from a baseball side. So I think there's a whole world of opportunity there that Major League Baseball hasn't tapped into yet. So how to get there in the future, I think, is open for exploration. But it seems to me that we'll continue to grow with the data, we'll continue to grow with the tech. However, the competitive advantage will be predicting behaviors about, the future and strategies. So that's at least how I'm thinking about it. But to Susan's point, I don't have any answers on how to do that.
Literally, if you took Luke's answer and just changed it from baseball to law enforcement, it would be 100% accurate and perfect. And going back to Michael's comment about, being in Star Trek, one of the books that seems to resonate within the community and almost all of us pick is Starship Troopers, and looking at that human factor, and that at the end of the day, the business I'm in involves forcing, if necessary, someone to do something they don't necessarily want to do. And so there's a ton of tech, there's a ton of things that support us. There's a lot more data. There's all these other systems, but at the end of the day, the predictability on the good guy side, like Luke's talking about, that relationship between the team, like that pitcher catcher relationship, so that we're all in sync, and then predicting what the threat actor behavior is going to be, so we can mitigate it, reducing risk to our people, reducing risk to third parties, and just equally as important, reducing risk to the bad guys. We do our best work when things are uneventful and no one gets hurt, and that's always been our goal and our objective. So when we look at this, everything Luke said applies, just laid right on top of tactical law enforcement. It's all the same stuff. It's all the same tactics. It's all the same strategy. We're just working through that neuroscience. And that's what really 2-3 years ago, when I first heard Dr. Johnson speak, I was like, I don't care how much it costs. I want more time with her, and I want more time in this. And it really opened up some doors for us to say, we are missing a huge part of what the potential way we can do, reduce risk and increase mission success. And we think neuroscience has it.
Well, it's nice to have such good fans in the room. We also need you. We need all of you, because you're sort of our testing and proving grounds out in the real world. And what we try to do is take core knowledge from the lab and move it out into the world. And all of you, right, are working in a space that's hard to stimulate in a laboratory, or unethical to do so in some cases. And so I think this idea of, what drives team synchrony, right, to Luke and Matt's questions, and how can we bring the human back into the conversation in a business organization is really what we're here to do. So with that, I think we'll take a wrap. But thank you all for sharing so much of your time with us today, and your thoughts and your preparations. And we really, really look forward to our future dialogues with each one of you.